Well, hello and welcome to Stewardship's Trustee and Treasurer Lunchtime Dial-In webinar. And whether you've joined us before or are new to Stewardship, it's great to have you with us today. My name is Jackie Fletcher and I'm the head of our Treasurer Services here at Stewardship, and I'll be your host on today's webinar. I'm delighted to introduce you to three of our resident experts today. I'm joined by Alan Howe and Stephen Matthews, who are both senior consultants here at Stewardship, and also Kevin Russell, who's our technical and advocacy director. Now, many of you are very familiar with the work that we do here for churches and Christian charities. But if you are new to Stewardship, then I will just take a moment to explain our vision, which is for the world to encounter Jesus through the generosity of his church. And one of the ways that we seek to achieve this is by strengthening Christian causes. And the purpose of this dial-in webinar is to equip and encourage you as you serve in such an important role within your organisation. And in doing so, hopefully will enable your church or charity to confidently live out your mission. If you'd like to find out more about how we could support your church or charity, do take a look at our website, or you can call our church and charity team. The number's on your screen now. And if you've joined us by phone, we will be sending the slides out after the call by email, so you'll be able to see that later. If you'd like to make sure that you receive the follow-up materials, including the podcast recording of today's webinar, you'll just need to ensure that you're signed up to the dial-in mailing list. So if you haven't done so already, you can find the sign-up form at www.stewardship.org.uk/dial-in. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page and you can add your details there. So firstly, before we get started, we'd like to issue a correction on one of our articles from the October dial-in. Hopefully you will have received our email, but in case you missed it, we referred to the temporary changes to Companies House filing requirements during COVID-19 and said towards the end of June, temporary modifications to filing regulations were signed into law that extends filing deadlines, generally by 3 months, for companies whose year end falls between the 27th of June 2020 and the 5th of April 2021. The reference to year-end dates was not correct and should actually have been a reference to the filing deadline dates. So we do apologise for this and hope that you found the correct details in the guidance that we linked up in the follow-up email if this was relevant to you. So on to today's agenda. Today we're going to be looking at the following during the call: churches and charity registration, risk management and how to assess risk. We're going to look at an update on the Charity Governance Code, Charity Commission 5-minute guides, reserves, holding too much or too little, and a cautionary tale on charity fraud. At the end, we'll have our Q&A session where you get to ask your questions of our panelists. So thank you to those of you who've already sent in your questions by email. This really helps us to understand the issues you're facing, and we'll cover those later in the call. So we do welcome your participation. This call is for you. So if you have any questions, please do use the chat function to ask them, and we'll answer as many as we can. Click on the chat icon, type in your question, and make sure it's addressed to all panelists. Those who have joined us on your phone, you won't be able to ask a question on the call, but hopefully those that are asked and the resources that we send out afterwards will address any issues that you might have. Right, so let's make a start on our agenda. The first item is all about churches and charity registration, and this is with Kevin. Oh, hello, Kevin, are you there?
Sorry, I muted myself instead of unmuted.
Absolutely fine, thank you, Kevin.
Okay, this is just a brief update about charity registration for churches in England and Wales. And it concerns those churches that are part of what I might call the historic mainline denominations. So if your church is based in Scotland or Northern Ireland, you can just take a little nap for a while. So in England and Wales, some, but not all churches have to register by law as charities with the Charity Commission. And those churches that have to register are those that either have an income of over £5,000 per annum, or for churches that are part of the defined historic denominations, that is Baptists, Methodists, Church of England, FIEC churches, United Reformed Church, Church in Wales and Presbyterian Church of Wales, the threshold for registration is increased from £5,000 to £100,000. And those with an income of under 100,000 don't have to register. And it's those churches in the second group of historic mainline denominations that need to be aware of a very recent change. Now, treasurers and trustees in these churches may well be aware that the regulations that created an exception for smaller churches with an income of £100,000 to not register were due to expire on 31st of March. But the good news is that the amending regulations were laid before Parliament in January, and that exception is extended for a further 10 years to 2031, 31st of March 2031. So does this mean that churches can forget about charity registration for another 10 years? Well, not exactly. The government has said that between now and 2031, the Charity Commission will develop a manageable approach for phasing those churches onto the register over the course of the extension period. And to do that, they're going to begin liaising with the church bodies during the latter part of this year to co-design and consult on a programme of phased voluntary registration. So that's the update. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Kevin. If that does apply to your situation, then do keep an eye on our blog on the website for updates. That's where we'll be posting them. Okay, so let's move on to our second item, which is risk management and how to assess risk. And this is brought to us by Alan.
Great, thanks very much, Jackie. So I guess the arrival of COVID-19 has probably elevated the concept of risk towards the very top of the priority list for most church and charity trustees. And we've all become experts now in trying to interpret government guidelines as we grapple with how and when to open our churches, how to best help our staff when working from home, what PPE and cleaning protocols we should have in place. But COVID is not the first nor the only risk faced by churches or charities. Risk in some form exists in every activity, project, or initiative that we undertake, just as it does if we do nothing or continue as we are. So, risk, or more importantly, the fear of its consequences, can paralyze organizations. Mark Twain once said that 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than by the ones that you did. And what are the fishermen that Jesus met in Matthew 4? If they'd concluded that it was too risky to answer Jesus' call, what a journey they would have missed out on. So, why is understanding risk important? Well, a few reasons really. Firstly, you don't always achieve your calling by playing it safe. In Numbers 13, the spies sent by Moses decided it was just too risky to take on the giants of the land, and so the dream of the promised land was lost for that generation. Sometimes great and otherwise unforeseen opportunities that can come from taking risks would be missed. So, what would have happened, for example, had David decided that the risk of fighting Goliath was too great? And thirdly, sometimes by taking a risk, you can break free of a safety net. In the parable of the talents, the safety first option of burying the talent was considered the poor choice. So, for most of the organizations that we represent, we too will need to embrace risk as we seek to move forward in God's will. But risk should not be accepted recklessly. In Acts 19, verses 23 to 41, we read about the potential for a riot. Paul wanted to address the crowd, but the other disciples considered the risk too great and allowed the local officials to quieten the crowd and so diffuse the situation. Now, in our experience, churches and charities are more likely to achieve their strategic aims by identifying and assessing risk and then taking action. Beyond that, the Charity Commission expects trustees of all charities to take a systematic approach to the consideration and management of risk. Now, this does not mean avoiding every risk, and when done well, risk assessment will provide a liberating experience for organisations rather than a stifling one. Okay, so far so theoretical. As a church or charity, how can we carry out a meaningful risk assessment? Well, step one is identify the risks that you face. Now here, think beyond those classic risks of fraud or buildings burning down. Our own risk assessment toolkit identifies 73 different risk topics in 11 different risk categories. Now these include things like strategic and leadership risk associated with employment, IT and data protection, communications, governance, finance, etc. Step two, then assess those risks. In an example to follow, I'm going to apply our own toolkit's methodology, acknowledging that other techniques are also available. But most techniques do tend to focus on three aspects. Firstly, what is the likelihood of the risk happening? The higher the likelihood, the higher the risk ranks. Secondly, what would be the impact on the organisation and its aims if the risk were to happen? Again, the greater the impact, the higher the risk ranks. And the third question assesses the controls that your organisation has in place to limit or mitigate the risk that it faces. The better those controls, the more the risk can be lowered. Our toolkit uses a score of between 1 and 4 when assessing both impact and likelihood, with 4 being considered high and 1 being considered low. The method for scoring controls is different, and I'll explain that when we get there in the example. Before we start, remember that risk assessment is an art and not a science. Judgment is needed at every step. So for this example, I've selected the operating policies risk from the legal and governance section of our toolkit. The sub-questions are designed to help you assess the risk and are not to be rated individually. So first, the likelihood. Reflecting on those sub-questions and setting aside existing controls, what is the likelihood that your organization's operating policies are not complete, operating properly, or have gaps? Perhaps as a leadership team, knowing that policies have not been a high priority, you might score this 3. So within a range of 1 to 4, this suggests a relatively high likelihood that a lack of policies poses a significant risk. Moving on to impact. Now, the failure to operate with effective policies could hamper an organization's operation, result in rushed or unfair outcomes, and may even lead to a loss of assets. So let's also give that a relatively high score of 3. Combining those two factors gives us a risk rating of 9, 3 for likelihood multiplied by 3 for impact. So before we consider any controls, see that the residual risk cell has turned red, meaning that currently the risk is considered high. Now, as we turn to controls, we need to assess those that we have in place. The more you can answer yes to those sub-questions, the better the level of controls. Now, the scoring system for controls is different from the others. Here, the score can range from 0, where you have no controls in place at all, up to the combined score of the likelihood multiplied by the impact, which in this case, if you remember, was 9. Now, scoring a 9 would mean that you consider the controls in place such that the whole risk is nullified. Now, whilst that's possible, it's highly unusual. Scores of less than 9 will leave a total score which represents the residual risk. This is the risk that remains after controls have been taken into account. Now, we may consider our controls pretty strong and assess that as a 5, thus leaving the residual risk at 4, being 3 times 3 equals 9 that we had previously, minus the 5 for controls. As you'll see, that cell is now coloured green, indicating that at this level, it is considered an acceptable risk. So if you can then apply that same methodology to all the identified risks, allows your organisation to prioritise those risks, and where the residual risk remains high, to deal with them. Organisations can then either choose to accept the risk, seek to avoid the risk altogether, find better ways to reduce that risk, or transfer the risk, which is typically done through insurance. And equipped with this assessment, your organisation will be better placed to move forward in achieving its goals. Now, we have a briefing paper on risk in churches, so we'll provide a link to that. And also the risk assessment toolkit, of which you've just seen a snippet there, is available in our online shop for £50. Thanks, Jackie.
Great, thank you, Alan. And for the helpful link to resources on the subject, we will include those in the follow-up email. Right, next on our agenda is Stephen, who's going to bring us an update on the Charity Governance Code.
Thank you, Jackie. Now, this update is about the Charity Governance Code, which was originally released in 2017 and has just been re-released with some minor changes. This is a code or set of general recommendations about what it says it is, charity governance. I will have to say the code is a surprisingly helpful document, setting out aspirational principles in 7 areas rather than a list of detailed requirements. It is useful to read alongside the Charity Commission detailed guidance in CC3, the Essential Trustee. It sets out the 7 principles that are to be really good as a board of trustees, and these are 1, organisational purpose, leadership, integrity, decision-making risk and control, board effectiveness, diversity, and openness and accountability. These may sound airy-fairy, but when properly considered by a group of trustees, I think it is genuinely helpful. It's also helpful in the code that it splits out what it suggests between large charities and small charities, so it doesn't suggest all of you operate like Oxfam or Cancer Research. It's also supported by an assessment template with questions to help trustees assess how well they're doing. I must admit, when I first heard about it in 2017, I approached it with a degree of cynicism, but I do genuinely think it's now a very valuable document, because the failure of governance is often one of broad attitude or ignorance rather than a breach of a detailed rule. I also think it's relevant to churches, even where the role of trustees is supportive of spiritual leadership and less determined than in many charities. It helps the trustees see not only its role overall and help not to get lost in the detail, but also the concept of governance, which can be weak in churches, as this is not an area that most spiritual leaders are trained in. The Proverbs talk a lot about wisdom, and the way spiritual leaders work alongside trustees is one of these wisdom areas. So my suggestion is that at least one trustee meeting covers it, on what areas you think you're doing well in and which you aren't. I think it will genuinely help your governance, and especially the way the trustees work as a team. Back to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really helpful to know. If you have any questions as we go through the call, do be typing them in the chat ready for our Q&A session at the end. Our next item is going to be from Kevin, and he's going to tell us about the Charity Commission's 5-minute guides. Kevin.
Thanks, Jackie. The Charity Commission have just published 5 very useful guides for trustees, which, for all intents and purposes, will be required reading. And each one is described as a core syllabus and, crucially, designed to help charities to meet their legal duties. And it's for that reason that the Commission is expecting all trustees to be familiar with them, and, in my view, should be read by anyone else in the charity who has a leadership position. The good news is that they're all very concise, easy to understand, and designed to be read in just 5 minutes. So what do they cover? I'm going to run through each of the titles and give you a flavour of what's in them, but I'll leave it to you to do your own homework. And each guide has links to more detailed advice should you need it. So here we go. The first title is Financial Oversight. This guide will be of particular appeal to us treasurers and covers things like protecting your charity's money, and makes it clear that this is the responsibility of all trustees, even if there is a financial expert handling the money side of things. Knowing your charity's financial position, which links into good financial management, budgeting, decision making, and so on. Then keeping accurate financial records. Then managing expenses and payments to trustees, guarding against improper payments or trustee remuneration. And then dealing with financial problems quickly, which of course is particularly important in these currently challenging times. So the first is financial oversight. The second guide is achieving a charity's purposes. This covers focusing on your charity's purposes. This is because a charity can only legally undertake the activities that pursue the charitable purposes set out in your own trust deed or alternative form of governing document. And you shouldn't really step outside of that, even if the wider activities are still for the public good. Then we have public benefit. Charities must act for the public benefit and not private benefit, or indeed public disbenefit. Then it talks about knowing what else your governing document says, such as how trustees should be appointed, how meetings are run, and how decisions should be made. And then there's a few words about charity and other relevant laws. So, financial oversight, achieving a charity's purposes. The third one is good decision making. Now I'm going to go into this one in a little more detail, as there's some important points to note. The guide talks about the principles of good decision making, such as acting within your powers, acting honestly with good intentions and only in your charity's interests, which means always being on your guard for potential conflicts of interest, such as employing a spouse or another trustee's business to do work for the church. Being sufficiently informed, taking advice where appropriate, taking account of all the relevant factors and ignoring irrelevant factors, managing conflicts of interest, and there's a separate 5-minute guide on that, and the overarching principle of making a decision that is within a range of decisions that a reasonable body of trustees could make. And that recognises that different bodies of trustees may make different decisions based on the same facts. The important thing is that the decision must be reasonable in the circumstances. Then the guide goes on to talk about keeping records. That's about keeping good minutes, which don't just note a decision made, but indicate who was at the meeting and what matters were taken into consideration that led up to the decision being made. Get the information that you need in order to make good decisions, which means gathering the facts that you need, analysing them if necessary, and taking appropriate professional advice and checking out on relevant Charity Commission guidance. Work together to make decisions. Trustees must make their decisions together, and every trustee, including anyone absent, is responsible for those decisions made at the meeting and must support and carry them out. For this reason, trustees should make attendance at meetings a priority, and the guidance helpfully includes what to do if you, as an individual trustee, fundamentally disagree with the decision, which in the extreme can mean the need to resign as a trustee. So, financial oversight, achieving a charity's purposes, good decision making. Number 4 is addressing conflicts of interest. Now, I won't go into detail on this one. I'm sure we're all aware of the idea of conflicts of interest, but the guide helps to identify types of conflict with the aid of helpful examples of financial conflict and perhaps less obviously loyalty conflicts. And then it sets out the 4 steps that charities should take to manage those conflicts of interest successfully, conveniently summarised under the headings declare, remove, manage, and record. And then the 5th and final guide is what to file with the Commission and what support is available. And I would suggest that the title for that one is fairly self-explanatory. So as I said earlier, it's sensible for anyone in a leadership position, as well as all trustees of the church, to go through these guides and to look into any more detailed guidance as appropriate. And to help you do that, we'll send a link at the end of the session. Back to you, Jackie.
Thanks, Kevin. That sounds like they're worth a look. Next, we're going to go to Alan. Alan, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit closer to the mic if you can. You were quite quiet during the first one. And Alan is going to tell us about reserves. Thank you, Alan.
Great, thanks, Jackie. I'll see if I can speak a bit louder for folks who are struggling to hear. Yeah, so thinking about reserves, the question we're just asking is, are we holding too much or are we holding too little? Now, as churches and charities, I wonder what your financial experience of COVID has been. What's been the impact on your day-to-day cash flow? Have you lost significant income streams? Have you seen costs reduce or maybe increase? The answers to these questions will inform the impact that COVID will have had on your organisation's reserves. Now, deciding what level of reserves to hold can be a hot potato issue for churches and Christian charities. Hold too much, and good money is tied up, not being used for the kingdom. Hold too little, and your whole organisation could be under threat during times of crisis or pressure. When we think about reserves, there are 2 biblical principles that we tend to apply. First, in Genesis 41, the principle of storing up in the good years reserves, in this case grain, for use in years of famine. And second, from Matthew 6, where Jesus tells us not to store up riches on earth. These teachings are complementary. Hoarding riches and treasures for their own sake is not encouraged. However, using riches, either now or in the future, for the benefit of the kingdom of God, or storing some of those riches for a future safeguard of the church or charity in harder financial times, are both sound kingdom principles. So, how much do we hold? As we consider this question, we work with the backdrop of the Charity Commission expecting charities to hold reserves and have a reserves policy, but offering no guidance on the appropriate level of reserves. That's up to you as trustees. So where do you start? Well, firstly, I suggest you need to understand your organisation's financial situation. So what is it that makes up your day-to-day cash flows? How resilient are your income streams? What situations will put those income streams under pressure? We know that letting space to external organisations is an income stream that has largely dried up during the pandemic. And how reliant are you on a small number of donors or clients? What off-sheet balance finance might be available to you? In this case, we mean what funds may be available quickly. So perhaps churches with a congregation of established homeowners may be able to raise funds quite quickly. And also, what makes up your cost base? What costs are fixed either for the short or longer period of time? Think about staff costs, leases, utilities, etc. What costs can be reduced quite quickly? Again, the pandemic has probably given experience of areas where this can happen. And also, what midterm, let's say in the next 2 to 5 years, capital or infrastructure costs are expected? So for example, do you need to upgrade your PA system? Are there any building repairs that are coming on? Those sorts of things. So armed with this information, you've then got a reasonable picture of your organization's cash flow. So secondly, you need to consider what situations might then impact on your organization. And I want to split these into two types. The first I'm going to call macro issues, and these are things that will impact all organizations. So as an example, it may be the state of the UK economy, as that impacts jobs and incomes. It may be government policy, for example, gift aid, charity taxation, etc. Or it may be unforeseen large-scale events. Again, the pandemic has given us a real-time experience of an unforeseen macro event. Now, most macro events, putting the pandemic aside, are likely to be slow burn with a long lead time and giving your organization room to plan and to make changes. The second group of issues are micro issues. So these are something that is more specific to your organization. So it may be the loss of a major donor or client. It may be the result of internal organizational politics. It may be because there is a significant unexpected infrastructure cost that arise. Now, many of these micro factors are more likely to come out of the blue, leaving us with less time to plan or to make structural changes. So having considered those two, we can now calculate our reserves policy. Now, often policies are considered in three parts. The first is money that's placed on one side to cover an organization's ongoing costs in the event of a loss of income or an increase in operating expenses. We'll call these funds running reserves. Now, given the reasonably well-established cash flows of most organizations, calculating a sensible level of running reserves should not be too difficult. Generally, running reserves will not be too large, but higher levels will be held in circumstances where organizations have higher risk scenarios, for example, long property leases or a tighter concentration of donors. The second area is money set aside for specific future projects. These funds, for example, building funds, are often held in restricted or designated funds until sufficient is available for the project to commence. And thirdly is money being set aside for anticipated but unknown future events. Now, Donald Rumsfeld, the then US Secretary of State, was widely ridiculed when he once spoke about known unknowns. Now, whilst he did not have COVID-19 in his thoughts, it can be argued that COVID-19 is a perfect example of a known unknown. The world's scientists had long been expecting a pandemic of some sort, but did not know what form it would take. Now, future unforeseen events impacting on your organization may not be quite as dramatic as a global pandemic, but history tells us that events will continue to come our way. And organizations that have set aside reserves for such events will have a buffer, buying them time to react. This is a good example of Genesis 41 in action, storing up in the good years for the years of famine that follow. Now, deciding just how much to store up for future unknown events is a difficult question. Fear of the unknown should never be the main driving force, as this will result in organizations hoarding excessive levels of reserves. But having a sensible buffer that gives a time window in which to react is wholly appropriate. And this current pandemic has probably tested your organization's resilience to some extent. Now, finally, remember that reserves are there to be used. And the whole point of holding them is for them to be tapped into in times of difficulty. The grain that was stored in Genesis 41 would have been of no use had it not been used when the famine struck. So as trustees, do not be afraid of dipping into your reserves if circumstances dictate. You may want to combine that with a plan to rebuild reserves over a sensible time period, but reserves are there to be used when needed. Again, we have a briefing paper on this entitled How to Think About Reserves. And again, we'll send a link to this with the paper in the follow-up. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. That's really helpful guidance on reserves. So let's move on to our final article now, which is from Stephen. He's going to bring us a cautionary tale on charity fraud. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I want to tell you a very sad story about a recent criminal case. It's about a man who pleaded guilty to fraud, both as a member of staff and as a volunteer, over a 6-year period, and stole more than £450,000 from 3 charities, one of which was a church, and as a result was given a 3-year prison sentence. He admitted stealing £287,000 from a London-based youth charity, where he worked as a finance officer, £130,000 from a London church, where he volunteered as a treasurer, and £38,000 from a higher education college in South London, where he was also employed. Police said that while working in these charities, he made payments using names that were similar to those of genuine suppliers and then amended the records to avoid raising suspicions. The police spokesman's comment was this: "He was one of the most devious individuals I've ever dealt with. He presented an image of someone caring, involved in his local community, leading a Christian lifestyle, and being generous with his money." He had become a trusted volunteer treasurer of a parish church in North London, where he stole £130,000 over a 5-year period. The vicar of the church said, "The community has a sense of shock and betrayal of trust as a result of these crimes." And secondly, that the charity was unlikely to be able to claw back the money that had been stolen. Now, my comment is that this sort of thing has major impacts on churches. It strikes at the heart of church family. It breeds discouragement and doubt about leadership, leading to cynicism, as well as the loss of the hard-given funds, which hurts so very much. The vicar's other comment was the church had strengthened its internal controls. I think there are 3 simple lessons I want to draw from this. Just because someone is a Christian or looks like one doesn't mean they can't defraud you, whether they're staff or volunteers. Remember, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. 2, simple financial controls make all the difference. Just having 2 pairs of eyes on everything stops most problems. 3, it can happen to you and not just someone else. So don't just listen to someone else's story, but really consider your own situation. So it's a sad story, but useful if it helps us get things right. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing that. That's really helpful. Okay, that does bring us to the end of our agenda for today. And before we move on to questions, I'd just like to take a moment to remind you that we have a range of COVID resources on our website. In particular, Kevin has compiled and regularly updates a directory of resources for churches, charities and Christian workers, and it gives detail on the latest government guidance, schemes and resources. As a measure of how often they're updated, I took these screenshots a week ago and it's already moved on, so it's definitely worth checking. It is an absolute gem of a resource, so do bookmark the page and refer to it regularly. You may also be interested in signing up for our Consultancy Helpline, where for a very affordable annual subscription, you have access to professional consultants who can answer your questions on a range of topics: charity governance, employment, charity law, property related issues and more. So details of the service and how you can sign up will be in the follow-up email after this call. But now we're going to address your questions. So if there is anything that you haven't yet asked, just type them in and we'll answer as many as we can in the time remaining. We've had some really interesting questions through, so thank you to those of you who have already sent them through. I'm going to start with a question, I think about probably for Kevin in the first instance. We're a small chapel with an annual income of around 15,000. Do we need to register with a charity commission? And if we do, where do we start?
Okay, well,
sadly, that is all we have time for today. If you have asked a question and we didn't have time to answer it, do check out the resources that are going to be coming out in the follow-up email in the next 24 hours. Hopefully these will answer any remaining questions that you may have, but if there's still anything you'd like to ask after you've had a read through, then please do get in contact. Now, included in the follow-up email is a very brief survey. I know that you've probably got lots of them sitting in your inbox, but this should only take around 3 minutes to complete maximum. And we are constantly reviewing how best we can use our resources in supporting churches and charities like yours. So it is really helpful if you can let us know what you think about our lunchtime dial-in service. Particularly if you haven't completed one for a while, do let us know what we're doing well and whether there's anything else you'd like us to include. Ultimately, we're here to serve you. So we really do appreciate you taking time to help us in this way. Now, our next dial-in is going to be on Thursday, the 24th of June in 2021, so do keep it free. We hope you'll be available to join us. Please feel free to invite anyone you know who may be interested. We're keen to address the issues that directly concern you in your roles, so thank you to all those of you who sent in your questions in advance. We'll be inviting you to do the same in June, so do look out for details on how to send your questions in. And remember, if you'd like to receive the follow-up materials from today's call, just make sure that you're signed up, www.stewardship.org.uk/dial-in. And now it just remains for me to say a very big thank you to our panelists, Alan, Stephen and Kevin, for taking the time to share their expertise and for answering so many of your questions today. And thank you all for joining us today. We do hope that you found it helpful and will join us on our next call. We pray that you and the organisations that you serve will be both blessed and a blessing as you serve in your communities over the coming months. Bless you. Thank you for joining.